Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise today in support of ACA 5 as Vice Chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. Our caucus has voted to support ACA 5. We think it's an extraordinarily important measure. I also want to thank my colleague from San Diego for being such a moral voice in this body and for bringing forward this important piece of legislation. The California Legislative Jewish Caucus supports this bill for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost because it is deeply rooted in our values. Our tradition teaches us to value justice, to value equity, to value human dignity, to value protecting the vulnerable. And so this is a piece of legislation that is very consistent with who we are and how we define ourselves as a community. It is also firmly rooted in our historic support for the civil rights movement. I can tell you there's a diversity of opinions on many things in the Jewish community, but one thing that is broadly shared in our community is the pride that we felt that so many rabbis and so many young people went and supported the civil rights movement. And there's an acknowledgement in our community that the struggle of the civil rights movement is so far from finished. And so we want to continue to be part of the solution and stand in solidarity with the black community and with other communities of color and with women as they continue to strive to seek equality. I want to respectfully suggest to some of my colleagues who might not be inclined to support this that I actually think it should be hopefully an easy vote for a lot of folks today. Because irrespective of how you feel about the policy, I hope that you recognize that we are in an extraordinary moment in history right now, an unprecedented moment. We have witnessed protests across this country, often in places where we would not expect them, where people, and particularly young people, are demanding not just justice for George Floyd, they're demanding systemic change. They're demanding systemic change. And my colleague and I from Palo Alto were talking last night about the fact that anyone who is under the age of 41 has not had the opportunity to weigh in on this issue, that our generation has not had the opportunity to speak to this and to have a conversation about it. It's been a quarter of a century since voters were given the opportunity. And I'd respectfully suggest that our generation, I'm 38, my colleague I think is approaching 40, we're not that young. Our generation has a different perspective on things. And I think it's time that we have the opportunity to weigh in on this issue, that we allow young people in the state of California and all people in the state of California the opportunity to have this conversation. And I think at this moment in time, witnessing the demand for justice and the demand for systemic change that we are witnessing from people across this country would be extraordinarily short-sighted of us. And I think I would suggest really tone-deaf for us not to permit voters to have an opportunity to weigh in on this. At the same time, I also recognize that this is a challenging and complicated issue for a lot of people because it requires us to be honest about some parts of our history that are hard to think about. It requires us to be honest about how badly the system is rigged in this country. And when I have conversations with folks about these issues, oftentimes people say, well, what about economic affirmative action? Why can't we just focus on poverty? And there's merit to that because we know that poverty is a real issue. But we also know that race and gender matter. We know that because study after study has demonstrated that there are different outcomes for people based on race and gender in education, in health, in job opportunities, in the way that they live their lives, and that is something that we need to be honest about. It also ignores history. It ignores the fact that there have been centuries of systemic racial injustice that have been embedded in so many parts of our public policy in this country. In education, in zoning, in housing, in so many different ways and in so many different facets of our public policy, we have seen things that have systematically disadvantaged communities of color and women. And the other thing that I would suggest to all of us when we are thinking about this is that I think all of us know in our hearts that race and gender matter. I don't think that there's a person in here who would dispute that at the end of the day, these are things that impact us and that impact people in the state of California this very day. And so for those reasons, I would respectfully suggest to my colleagues that this is a really, really important vote. And to those who might think that this is that affirmative action is something that's zero-sum, I'd offer an alternate perspective. That this is actually that actually creating more opportunity for more people is something where all of us can win. And I think a lot about the seminal Supreme Court cases from the early 2000s about affirmative action in public higher education, and the fact that some of the strongest and most persuasive arguments that were ultimately cited in Justice O'Connor's opinion came from the military and came from the business community that weighed in support of affirmative action because they know that it's essential to our competitiveness of our businesses, to the strength of our military. And so I would suggest to everybody that everybody will benefit from this. We will have a society that's freer, that's healthier, that's stronger, that's wealthier, that's more cohesive, that's more equitable, and more just. And we'll also have a society that's brave enough to be honest about how badly the system is rigged, and brave enough to do something about that. And I think that's a beautiful gift for us to leave to our children, and we respectfully request.